All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for spending a little bit of your Friday with us. This is another edition of Fridays on the Farm, something we started new here in 2021. And I'm just happy to see a lot of new names from even the last time we did our session. Today, we have some awesome guests, and I will introduce them in just a minute. So we're going to talk about innovative strategies for weed suppression. So that can mean a bunch of different tools and management methods, and I think we'll touch on quite a few of those today. So the Organic Farm team is just a service program that I'm a part of. My name's May. I'm the production protocol manager with Dakota's Best Seed, and I help with the Organic Farm team. I specifically work in our transition toolkit program, trying to help growers that have questions and challenges as they embark on the transition to organic process. We have a lot of different partners and affiliates that work with us as well. And throughout our webinar series, some of them will show their pretty faces and talk a little bit more about what we do there. A little bit about me, and it cut off my cool selfie with a baby lamb here, but just a little bit about my background. I'm just sort of going to MC the conversation today. I came to Dakota's Best after being an organic inspector for several years, full-time, and just really fascinated still with organic systems and the endless challenges that people encounter along their way. So we will talk more about those today. I'm not going to talk too much more about myself. Here's my contact information. I'll pop that up again at the end. But now I will actually let Paul share his screen. So just give me a minute here. Our first speaker today is going to be Paul Mugge, coming to us from his farm in Northwest Iowa. So Paul, whenever you're ready, go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. There, can everybody hear me and see the picture? I hope. I am Paul Mugge. I live in Sutherland, Iowa, Bryan County. It's about 50 miles from Minnesota and 50 miles from South Dakota. So I'm kind of right up in the corner. And I put my contact information up on the screen. I want to welcome anyone to contact me later. You know, if you have questions or just want to chit chat about organic, that would be great. I want to say it up front here that I don't have all the answers. So I don't want anybody to go home and think that they got to do it this way because Mugge does it this way, because that'll probably be wrong. It really has to be different. You have to find your own system. And another thing is some of the pictures that I have of my farm look pretty nice, and it doesn't always look that way. I mean, I have some mistakes too, and I have some pictures that I can show later if you want that might curl your hair. But I've been farming since 1976, been organic for about 20 years. I just have 300 acres of row crops, so I'm a pretty small farmer. I have a wife and 3 children and 7 adorable grandchildren. And I want to encourage everyone to ask questions at the Q&A at the end of these sessions. This will be better for everybody if we can just have a discussion. And if you want to ask me about my grandkids, that'd be perfectly all right too. So it all begins with crop rotations, and it's different for everybody depending on their resources and how they feel. It's intended to disrupt the pest life cycles. Particular crops select for particular weeds, and it doesn't matter what your system is, but there's going to be some weed that is perfectly adapted to that system. So you can't be married to any one thing. You have to mix it up a little bit. I try and rotate a number of things: row crops, solid seeded, grasses and legumes, fall seeded, spring seeded. I rotate tillage systems, annual perennial crops, cash crops, cover crops. But I think you need at least a 3-year rotation. My current rotation, corn, soybeans, and small grains. Small grains depends a little bit on what the market is looking for at the moment. My My preference is winter triticale, which is in that picture, because I have a good market for it. And it's really nice to have a fall seeded crop in the rotation to mess up the cycle of the summer annual weeds. I employ some cultural methods. I plant a high population for both, well, for all my crops. Planting date, I plant corn quite late, mid to end of May. Beans and oats, not so much. Narrow rows is kind of a mixed bag. I plant 30-inch rows. Some people go narrower because you get a quicker canopy, but then you're cultivating a smaller percentage of the area. So there's a trade-off there. Cultivar selection is important. You need something with strong germination, strong emergence. It's so much easier to cultivate if you have an even stand when all the plants are the same size. You need early canopy, and sometimes if things don't work so well, you need something that will yield in the presence of weeds, and there are differences in cultivars. So corn, that's the 1 year of my 3-year rotation that I have to do full width tillage. So because it has red clover the year before, so I have to kill the red clover. It's disked, field cultivated once or twice, depending on the year. I plant about 35,000 population, harrow or rotary hoe, hopefully 3 times, cultivate 3 times. But you know, that depends on the weather. That's ideal, and ideal doesn't happen very often. I do have RTK guidance, which helps, and seems to work in most years. Corn hints, don't plant early. Like I said, I plant really never before May 15th. We have untreated seed, and you just can't plant into cold, wet soils. You must have a stand. If there's a gap in the stand, you're going to have weeds there. And don't hesitate to replant. You know, I think it hurts to replant. It's hard, but I think every year that I have been faced with that decision of whether to replant or not, I think when I've decided to replant, I was glad I did. And when I've decided not to, I wished I would have. You know, it hurts, but you have to do it. And I think the red clover is worth at least 20 bushel an acre. Soybeans, my soybeans are ridge tilled. I don't know how many people are familiar with that. It's basically no till, except that I'm going to cultivate. The pass on the left has been planted. I scrape the top inch or 2 off of that old corn row and plant the beans right into that same row. It's just a perfect seed bed. It's a really great system for organic soybeans. Not too many people do it anymore, but I love it. This is what it looks like right after planting. The neat thing about it is all of that residue is still there, protecting the soil. The bad part of that, of course, is it might be tough to get, you know, the residue from 200 bushel corn through a 30-inch cultivator. That's sometimes a challenge. This is what it looks like when the beans are small. And again, you can see all that residue is still there, and the beans are up high on a ridge where it's warm and dry. So I plant my beans when everybody else is planting beans, the first week in May. And that way they get up and get ahead of the tall water hemp and some other weeds. And I plant my beans before I plant my corn. I also have a cobbled together buffalo rolling stock chopper. The picture on the upper left is behind the tractor tire, and that soil is going to be hard and dry, and you get some of these clods. And to go over it with that rolling chopper, yeah, it's an extra trip, but it's fast and cheap, and it turns that upper left to the lower left. It breaks up the root ball of any larger weeds, so it kills them. It redistributes that residue evenly over the soil surface, and it sure makes it easier on my bean walkers. And again, it works. I cultivate hopefully 3 times. The beans are walked. In this picture, they've been cultivated once and not walked yet. And again, all of that residue is still there. And it works, usually. Winter triticale, it follows soybeans. It's no-till drilled. early October, right behind the soybean combine. And the next trip over the field would be with the combine in July. I have a Great Plains no-till drill. And if you came back to this field a week later, you couldn't even tell you'd been over it with the drill. So that soil is protected during the winter. Fertility management, like I said, I have a cover crop, usually red clover. I get a little bit of chicken litter, very little, sometimes none. And I have access to some beef manure, and I compost that. You can see the red clover in this picture underneath that triticale. It's just broadcast over top in the spring, and it sits there about 6 inches tall until I combine the triticale over the top, and then it takes off. I get weed control. There's a bunch of biomass out there, ground cover, nitrogen. Like I said, I get 80 to 100 pounds of nitrogen from it. I have habitat for beneficial insects. It might catch some excess nutrients, allelopathy, soil protection. It has a lot of benefits. This is what it looks like maybe along about Labor Day. There are a few weeds, like you can see, so I clip it, and it's going to come back and get ahead of the weeds, and there won't be a weed in it, and it will grow, until Christmas time. So I've got plants out there covering the soil all year and living roots in the soil all year for that 1 year of my rotation. I do compost, like I said, and I have a compost turner, so I make pretty good compost. As far as weed management, this is some work done by Matt Liebman at Iowa State University dealing with seed predation. And the horizontal scale is the months, and the vertical scale is the percent control. And like in my case, where I'm not doing any fall tillage, if those weed seeds are on the soil surface for 7 months, 70% of them are going to be eaten by something. But you have to leave them on the soil surface. And it's probably more than that, because you have earthworms and birds that are consuming some as well. The secret is you have to leave the seed on the soil surface. You can't do any fall tillage, and I do none. And I don't do any primary tillage. You have to provide habitat for them. Field borders, I have some narrow prairie strips I'll talk about in a second. Diversity helps. Those guys need a place to live. I do have some narrow prairie strips that include beetle banks that hopefully provides habitat for those seed predators. There's a beetle bank on the edge of each one of those strips. I try and take advantage of allelopathy. In this picture, there's winter triticale on the right and flax on the left. These rows are north and south, so I don't really think it's a sunlight effect. And there's actually a row of flax, another row right next to the triticale that's completely gone. And if you're not familiar with allelopathy, many plants exude chemicals from the roots that inhibit the germination and early growth of other plants. In this case, the triticale is inhibiting the growth of that flax next to it. And I try and take advantage of that too. You have a flame cultivator. I think James is going to talk about, not this particular one, but he's going to talk about flaming in a minute. So I may too. It's going to be really hard to see, but there's beans in rows just at the cotyledon stage that are getting flamed right over the top. I want to talk just for a minute about diseases and insects. I really haven't had a major problem, except for soybean aphids in the 20 years that I've been organic farming, because I think I'm using free ecosystem services. The deal is a monoculture, which is basically what corn and soybeans are. You have 2 summer annual row crops. In 1945, 7% of the world's crops were lost to insects. 50 years later, 1995, after millions of dollars and billions of pounds of chemicals, 14% of the world's crops were lost to insects. So we're winning a battle now and again, but we're losing the war. And part of it is insect resistance to pesticides. Part of it is that we're killing the beneficial insects too, if you're out there spraying. A couple more examples of that. This is dealing with nematodes. This is some work from Michigan State University. They have, nematodes get kind of a bad rap, but there's hundreds, maybe thousands of species of nematodes, and the vast majority of them are actually good guys. So these researchers were looking at the ratio of good guys to bad guys. And there's 4 different cropping systems. Number 1 is strictly conventional, corn, soybeans, wheat. Number 2 is the same as 1, except the herbicides are banded. And number 3 is the same as number 2, except they use compost instead of synthetic fertilizer. And number 4 is a completely organic system. And you can see that the ratio of good guys to bad guys is like 3 times as great in the organic system, because we aren't killing the bad guys. One more example, this one from Indonesia, where they raise a lot of rice. And apparently rice has insect and disease issues. They were spraying, I think was 37 different chemicals that were approved for application to control rice pests. And they were, the average was like 4.5 applications per year. The cost to the farmer, well, I should go back. At the urging of a Hindu priest, the Indonesian government said, okay, we're going to ban all of those herbicides, all of those pesticides except for one. And that one is restricted in when it can be used. So they went from 4.5 applications to, a third of an application per year. Cost to the farmer went way down. The cost to the government went down to like 1/10 of what it was. And conventional wisdom would say this is going to be a disaster. But yields actually went up because they weren't actually killing the bad guys anymore. And we're taking advantage of the free ecosystem services. I have had a problem with this guy, soybean aphids, for a couple years, but now Iowa State University conventionally developed and bred genetic resistance to soybean aphids, and I plant all aphid resistant beans anymore, and they're very effective. I haven't had any issues since. The narrow prairie strips, I've had one, the first strip was planted like 18 years ago. These were about 4 years ago, and I have a newer one that's only a year or 2 old. And they provide a multitude of benefits, biodiversity, wildlife habitat, pollinator habitat. Iowa State has a strips project that sort of began this whole thing. And if you have 100% of your crop field in crop, they found 13 plant species, 1 bird species, 2 birds per field. But if you put 10% of it in prairie strips, you have a 4-fold increase, twice the bird species, 32% less runoff, 95% less soil export, 82% less nitrogen export, 89% less phosphorus export. So they're as effective as terraces in resource conservation, but you get all of these other benefits too. And in addition to that, they're just plain beautiful. As far as energy goes, organic agriculture kind of gets criticized for this sometimes because people see us making so many trips over the field, and yeah, I'd like to make less trips too. I'm working on that. This was some work from David Pimentel at Cornell University. The two systems on the left are both organic. One was manure and one was legume. The one on the right is conventional, and this is just the amount of fossil fuel energy that is used in those systems. The big chunk, of course, here in blue is nitrogen fertilizer. Actually, 1% of all the fossil fuel energy used in the world goes to produce anhydrous ammonia, and we don't use any of that. And pesticides are energy intensive too. You probably didn't expect to see a jug of Roundup on my slides, but I can rotary hoe twice and cultivate twice and use 578 megajoules per hectare. Hope you don't mind metric units. And I could spray Roundup once, and this is only the Roundup. This is not even the application of it. And it takes 763 megajoules, and it's probably a lot worse now. This slide's relatively old. People spray higher rates now and probably spray more than once trying to kill resistant weeds. I also have an 18 kilowatts solar PV array, provides all electricity for my farm and my home. Here's some of the results. This is 30-year Rodale Institute comparison. Yields are about equal, profits better. Again, use about 2/3 the amount of energy, 30% less greenhouse gas. So this is a slide from Rodale white paper. Oh, I can't even read it because you guys are all in my way. Let me find it here in my notes. Regenerative agriculture absolutely can feed the world, and it can do it while stabilizing the climate, regenerating ecosystems, restoring biodiversity, and enhancing rural communities. So, you know, people say organic can't feed the world, and I don't think that's true. One last thing, this is Ratan Lal from Ohio State University. And this is, I think, very thought-provoking. He said, when people are poverty-stricken and starving, they pass on their suffering to the land. But I think it's equally true and perhaps more poignant that if you turn that around, if the land is stricken, if it's eroded or overtilled or overgrazed or nearly devoid of life, then it passes its suffering onto the people who depend on it for their sustenance. On any given day, there are 71 million people displaced from their homes, and some, admittedly, are fleeing persecution and violence, but many are climate refugees, and they're fleeing degraded soils that are no longer able to support them. And their numbers are probably going to increase with climate change. And I think organic agriculture may have a part to play in helping to relieve some of that suffering for both the land and for its people. So I'm back to where I started, my 7 grandkids. That, as the Native American proverb says, we don't inherit the land from our fathers, we borrow it from our children. And I hope to leave my farm in a better place at the end of my tenure and not destroy the world in the process. So I'm done. Again, I hope that you will ask lots and lots of questions after James. So I'm gonna stop sharing here, and James, it's all yours.
Well, and before we jump over to James and while he's getting set up to share his screen, and I'll introduce him as well, we do have a couple questions that came in. Paul, we had one asking, do you have any weeds present when you plant your soybeans, or do you wait to do your pass with the flame weeder, and that's how you address that?
It depends a lot on the year. Sometimes there are a lot of weeds there when I plant, and that buffalo planter cleans about a strip a foot wide or so. So any weeds that are on the top of that ridge where I'm going to plant the row get scraped off. Any volunteer corn that's there gets shoved off into the middles where I'm going to cultivate it. So after I plant, there are still weeds in those row middles because there's been no tillage there, but the rows are relatively clean until I cultivate. And that's one of the problems, because sometimes it looks horrible until you cultivate that first time. But yeah, I always have weeds.
Well, that's a good lead into the second question, asking, you mentioned you do have some hand weeding.
Yes.
What are the most common weeds? I'm assuming broadleaves are what they address. What are the specific varieties out there that you're having to deal with?
The ones I really want to get are buttonweeds, lamb's quarters, tall water hemp, smartweeds. Those are the main ones. And annual broadleaves, for the most part, that got missed. Generally, if everything works, there are not many to pull. But occasionally Mother Nature doesn't cooperate. If it rains the whole month of June, I'm kind of screwed.
Well, right, and that part of that question was, are you planting beans any earlier in recent years? because I'm just assuming here your area has been a little bit drier in the
Yeah.
spring. So has that had an effect on your planting date with beans then?
Yeah, again, I plant my beans like the first week in May, before corn, whenever all my conventional neighbors are planting beans, and that helps them get ahead of the weeds because they're up on that ridge where it's warm and dry, and they'll take right off. It's a perfect seed bed.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Paul. And I did see a comment here from Bob asking, how can I learn to get started with prairie strips? As an Iowa State alum, I'm so excited. Paul is into prairie strips. I was in the same building with a lot of the researchers involved in that project. So it's very near and dear to my heart as well. And I'm so excited that it's been something that's working for you. So Bob, I'll follow up with you with some of the resources that are out there on prairie strips. Awesome stuff.
Yeah, yeah, thanks for that question. I should have mentioned too that there is a lot of help from the NRCS. One of my strips is, the first one was CRP and the next ones were CSP. And you can get help, like Xerxes Society, for example, has a lot of information. And Iowa State Strips Project does too. They're
Yeah,
great.
absolutely. Yeah, the whole pollinator issue has really raised the level of support and awareness of these kind of practices too.
Yep, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate that.
Thanks again, Paul, and we'll switch it over to James. James just kind of showed up on my desk here, willing to help us out today because he has a background with flame weeding that's really interesting, and I'm so excited he was able to join in today and do the whole screen sharing and Zoom bit here. James comes to us from outside Grand Island, so I'll let him take it away.
Okay, can you all hear me? Very good, and you can see my screen. So that is my family, my wife Megan and our 3 children, and we're happily married almost 10 years now, and life has been good for us. Been very blessed. A little bit of our history. So my ancestors homesteaded and broke sod in 1878, just about a mile and a half from where we live. A few generations later, my dad started transitioning to organic in 1985, and then by the mid 90s, he was fully certified. And then I was born in 90, so right in the middle of that, I was born into organic farming. So I've kind of grown up with it and had the privilege of working alongside my dad and learning and loving it as we go. And so today we farm about 850 acres, all certified organic, and it's been a journey, and we really enjoyed it. They wanted me to talk about flaming today. So I would say the mid 90s, I can't remember the year for sure. I guess my dad bought his first flamer from Dennis Lutke up in Wells, Minnesota. And we got started flaming back then. And then as technology changed with RTK and just being able to be more precise with planting and cultivating, we started to look for ways to improve the flamer. So we came up with our own row unit design with a flamer that had a hood to help hold the heat in over the top of the row where we were focusing, trying to control the weeds. Those are the hardest weeds to control, is right in the row. Everything between the row we felt like we could clean up just fine with a cultivator with what we were doing. So we came up with this design, a few features. The hood, like I mentioned, helps hold the heat in and also helps with any crosswind. Some of the variabilities there. A lot of times in the springtime, chances are the wind's blowing, and that's really helped. It doesn't eliminate that variable entirely, but it does aid in that. And then we came up with our own ignition system as well to light the flamer from the tractor seat, which made it safer, and then also If a burner does go out, we have it so it will automatically reignite it. A lot of times when we have a torch go out, it's usually when you're turning around on the end. If you have some tall grass borders, which all of our ends of our fields, we've got grass edges, and if there's tall grass, usually that can sometimes be enough to snuff it out. And so that's one feature that's been nice. So we plant, and the first thing we do is flame. We don't do any rotary hoeing beforehand, and on our corn, we wait till the corn is 4 to 6 inches tall is when we like to do it, and ideally we like to follow the flamer with a cultivator just simultaneously. We found that our best weed control in corn is burn the weed and then bury it right away, and that cleans everything up between the row as well as in the row. You can see the row on the right was probably maybe 15-20 minutes after burning, and the row on the left was just a minute or two. So you can see the color change in the leaves, and they turn brown and look pretty sick shortly after. But we've done it enough that that doesn't bother us, because we know a few short days later things start to green up and grow out of it. You can see on the right here, this would have been a pass we did the day before, so you can just see how much the color has been bleached out of the leaves. But we flame it, cultivate it, bury the weeds, and then we just let it sit, and we're usually good for a couple weeks generally before we have to come back and cultivate again if we do that right. This is popcorn growing out of it. This is probably, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 days after we flamed. A lot of people, one question I get a lot is, are you going to kill the corn? Am I going to kill it? Am I going to create a yield drag? And I can honestly say we've done it enough. And if there is a yield drag, we're okay with it, because we have had really fantastic results, and I really can't see any yield drag per se in what we've done over the last 10-15 years where we've been doing a lot of flaming. And we flame. Some guys we talk to, they'll only flame if they feel like they really need to, but we've kind of come to the conclusion that we'll flame every acre every year. That's kind of our plan, and the results have been very good and very repeatable, dependable, year in and year out. We've had really good success. Whenever we've not flamed, we've usually regretted it. I've got a few photos here of on the corn. You can see where my cursor is. We had one burner right at the beginning of the row go out, and you can notice the pigweeds growing there. The corn's a little taller because it didn't get set back a little bit by the flaming. But then you look at the other rows next to it. The only thing difference there was the torch went out for 15-20 feet before it relit. And you can notice the broadleafs in the row right there. Any questions on flamer or flaming corn? Before I go on to soybeans, we do something that a lot of people are pretty shy about, and that's flaming soybeans. But I'll give it a minute here if anyone has any comments or questions.
I think we're good to go if you want to dive right in. I'm excited to see folks' questions after your next couple.
Yeah. Okay.
It looks like we did have a question about your fertility program, so maybe you can get to that towards the end.
Yeah. Yep. For sure.
Thanks.
So we've been flaming soybeans for, I would say, close to 10 years now, and we do it when most people would say not to. you know, a lot of people would recommend, if you're going to flame, do it at the cotyledon stage, which is okay. You probably have less chance of damage to the soybean at that stage, but we found that there just are not enough weeds emerged to justify flaming when the beans are that small. So we wait until the, I'll see if this is, so we wait until the beans are at a 2-leaf stage. At that stage, there's usually enough weeds germinated and emerged, and we found that there's a very fine line on temp, a lot more variables, and you can kill a bean. We've done it, and so you have to really pay attention and know your machine well and how to set it. We found that the temp of the day, if it's sunny or cloudy, the humidity, there's just a lot more variables that go into play, and even your soil too. If you've rotary hoed your beans, I would recommend not trying to flame them. We like the soil firm and kind of compacted almost from a light rain, as you see in this picture here. It leaves all the weeds that are germinated and emerged fully exposed. If you rotary hoe or have any sort of tillage where it kind of breaks up that top soil layer on the top, you end up protecting some of those little weeds that could be germinated. So after we plant, we like to just leave it sit, and the first thing we'll do is come in and flame the soybeans. This is just minutes after flaming. Those 2 leaves, the unifoliate leaves, they'll shrivel up and die, turn brown and fall off. The next trifoliate at that stage is just in a tiny bud stage. Those 3 little leaves are about the size of a mouse's ear, and they're kind of tucked in a little bud, and they're usually protected pretty well from the flame, and the bean will grow right out of it. That's about 4 hours after the bean. The things we look for when we're flaming soybeans is we don't want to scorch the stem of the bean. If we flame, a lot of times we'll make a pass and we'll just stop and we'll let things sit for 10-15 minutes, because you can tell in a short amount of time the amount of damage you've done to the bean, and find out what's acceptable, whether or not you need to make some adjustments or if you're okay to go on. But if you notice that your stem is scorched and blistered, you're probably too hot and you need to cut your heat down. And we'll cut pressure back on our flamer or speed up or both. It just kind of depends on the environment around us. But these beans right here, that's about the perfect damage, I would say, is what we would call acceptable. Very little scorching, no blistering. Those beans will grow right out of it. And the reason we feel like we can get by flaming beans at this stage and cut our heat back and still get good effective weed controls, because the weeds are very small. They're hard to see in this picture, but at the end of my mouse there's a little broadleaf, and there's a few other grasses I think you can pick out. They're really tiny, and when they're that small, they're very easy to kill. It doesn't take near the temp, which with beans at this stage you cannot flame at a higher temp. Here's a picture 6 days after flaming. We haven't done anything to the field since then, and we're going to go in and cultivate 5, 6, 7 days after flaming. What we feel that the flaming almost triggers something in that bean plant and causes it to elongate and just shoot straight up, and then that trifoliate will open right up, and those beans are about 4 inches tall, I'd say there, and it makes it pretty easy to go in there and do our first cultivation. Here's a photo of just the weed suppression that we get from the flamer in the row. You can see the band right over the row where the flamer went, and notice the height of the weeds in the row versus between the row. Had we not flamed, we would have had that same maturity height of weeds right through our entire row. So we feel like the flaming buys us time, and it gives us that height separation between the bean and the weeds growing, trying to compete with each other. So this picture, or I'll go back. So the 6 days after flaming, I mentioned we're going to go right in and cultivate. This is that same field, same place. We're cultivating and rolling dirt right up into the row. And that's kind of how we end the flaming then, as we follow with a cultivator. And then on this picture here, we've got another row check. So if you notice this row on the right, the only thing difference on this field and that row there is we had a burner go out for a period at the beginning of the field. Everything else was the same practice the whole year, but just to show the value that we see in using a flamer just gives us an edge on weed control, we feel like. We walk all of our beans, and this was, I think, the day we were out roguing. I took this picture. So any questions or comments? Hang on a second. I think I had something muted there. Try that again.
Do you ever use a foliar to help the beans recover from being wilted?
We have not.
I can see why that would be tempting for somebody to do that.
Yeah. And that might be, we've never tried it, but that might be something worth trying. But no, we haven't. And generally, if done right, flaming beans, they really don't even stop growing. They'll just push right on through. The first 2 days, they look pretty sad. You drive by and you question your methods, and but a lot of times it's better just to not drive by for about 3 or 4 days and just have faith that they'll pull through. But like I said earlier on, flaming beans is more risky, and you really need to pay attention to the variables, the weather conditions, your temp, and pay real close attention to the damage of the bean at that stage. But once a grower gets a good feel for that, it can be very successful, we found.
James, we have a couple other questions coming in here. Wondering, does the system you're describing, the way you utilize flame weeding, does it vary in how efficient and effective it is depending upon the weed pressure? So have you ever had too much weed pressure that it can't handle it?
Grass is probably the biggest hurdle with flaming, because it is virtually impossible, we found, to kill grass with a flamer. And when you have heavy grass pressure, the best you can do is set it back, we found, and you just can't kill it effectively. But that's kind of why we cultivate, especially with the corn, right after we flame, because when we flame it, it burns those grass leaves back almost down to ground level, and we feel like it takes less dirt to cover that grass then. So, I mean, the more weed pressure there is, yes, it is more of a challenge, but I don't look at the flamer as just the one tool to, it's not a one tool cure all. Like it's a tool in the toolbox, and you can do a good job flaming and a bad job cultivating, and you can lose the game. We feel like they all have to be done right and build on top of each other and complement each other to accomplish the end goal of a clean field.
For those of us northerners that aren't as familiar with popcorn, does the row spacing kind of have to be the way you have it set up because of the way popcorn grows, or are there other considerations that kind of affect your need for the flame weeding?
We're on 30-inch rows. We really don't treat popcorn any different than we would white corn or field corn, yellow corn. Popcorn has its own characteristics, negative ones usually. It's a little weaker stalk. Sometimes the roots are a little weaker. It can tend to go down in a wind easier. But other than that, as far as flaming, we don't treat it any differently.
Okay. We had one last question here come in. How much propane are you using per acre? I'm sure it's different depending on corn or beans.
Yeah. So on our corn, generally, I would say we're 6 to 8 gallons per acre on our banded flaming with our row unit over the row. On soybeans, we cut that in half. I would say we're even a little more than half. We're probably in that 2.5 to 3.5 gallon rate on flaming soybeans. So that's a good question.
Does propane fluctuate in price in your area very much?
It can. I'd say on average, we've probably been about $1.10 the last several years on our cost for propane for flaming. So it's the price of propane and flaming really is small, very small. We think, we're 10, $12 at the top end, for propane an acre, which we find we don't worry about the price too much. I know a few years back it got up there. I forget how high it got. I think it got above $2 for a short time one year, but no, we don't feel like it fluctuates too much. Maybe the further north where it might fluctuate more. I don't know. So.
Well, I think folks might be interested to learn a little bit more about your rotation too.
Sure.
So why don't you pop into some of those slides? I was really interested.
Let me scroll up here. So, so currently we're doing, we call it 5 crops in 3 years. We're doing winter wheat. After our wheat, we will put in occasionally, not every year, but sometimes we'll put in a summer cover crop mix, and it might be sorghum and buckwheat and a whole variety in a mix for 6 to 8 weeks between or after we harvest the wheat until we would put in our fall cover crop. That fall mix is hairy vetch primarily with a small grain. It's been oats the last couple years. We put the oats in with the vetch just to protect it through the winter. Vetch, if it's protected, it'll overwinter pretty good. And then after that, in the following spring, we go into corn. Popcorn generally is what we've been doing the last few years on most of our corn acres. Then after corn in the spring, we've been, last few years, we've been playing around doing some small grain oats and mustard cover crop. and just trying to aid a little bit in some of that allelopathy effect of some of those cover crops before we go into beans. So we're pretty excited about that. And then after soybeans, we start the rotation again. We'll fall seed winter wheat after the soybeans come out, and just repeat that 3-year rotation. That's been working pretty good for us. Probably the last, I think it's been about 7 years we've been doing that. Before we did the 3-year rotation, we were doing a 4-crop 4-year rotation, and we had alfalfa. So we had corn, beans, wheat. We'd fall seed alfalfa, hay it for a year, and then we would go right back into corn. But it got increasingly hard to dry hay in our area. Seems like the rain and the humidity has increased, and so it got to be more of a challenge to do that. So we backed out of the alfalfa and went to more cover crops in our rotation. And we do use some compost, some chicken litter, just to supplement a little bit, help keep our phosphorus levels up and add a little extra nitrogen when needed. A few pictures of some cover crops growing. We got vetch and oats. We had some radish, and I don't know if we had some mustard in the mix a couple years ago. This is 38 days after seeding. That's my daughter Mila out helping me check fields. We had really good growth on our cover crop this last fall. It was a good fall for it. We had, I think before the first hard freeze, our oats were up 12, 14 inches tall, and the vetch had pretty much fully covered the ground underneath that canopy of the oats. And then the oats, when they froze off, they laid down and just made a beautiful blanket to protect it through the wintertime. Here's some vetch in the spring. We shred it, and then we use a high-speed disc to incorporate it. We found that this high-speed disc has really cut down on our tillage. We feel like we can do one pass with this, which would have taken us 2 to 3 passes with our older tandem disc we used to use. And so we can incorporate high residue cover crops and get them seed bed prepped really efficiently and in a shorter time window than we used to be able to do. We always compare our practices. So we shredded this cover crop, and then we left a little strip unshredded just to see how it performed differently. And you can't tell a whole lot of difference after the disc went through it, a little bit, but we found that even just using the shredder to shred our cover crop is almost as good as another tillage pass, and just breaking that residue up into small pieces that the tillage tool can incorporate and mix into the soil and leave a smoother seed bed. We're all about trying to keep it smooth and not rough and cloddy, and just makes everything else work better. We're working under some corn stalks. We've got a seeder we put on our high-speed disc a year ago for planting oats and mustard in the spring is our plan. So when we work under our corn stalks, we'll plant that cover crop right in the same pass. That's one thing we're going to be doing a lot more of this spring. So.
Well, I know we have a couple other Nebraskans on the call. Keep your questions coming in. We got about 5 minutes left here.
Okay.
We got a question from Paul for you. How soon do you plant corn after disking the vetch? And have you had seed corn maggots?
We have had some issue with seed corn maggot. I would say usually we're about 10 days, 10 to 14 days after we incorporate it. Kind of just depends on the weather. 2019 was a hard year, hard spring to get in, and so I think there were some years just looking at the weather, we probably rushed it more than we should have, but it all worked out in the end. Some days it's about a week, only 7 days apart, but if we can let it sit 2 weeks, we will. We like to. Generally, it's about the last week of April when we'll shred and terminate our cover crop, and then the 10th of May is a good time. We think the 10th to 15th of May is a good starting point. We feel like for planting corn. We've tried planting corn earlier, and seems like we always get in trouble with a cold spell that comes through or cold wet, and seems like we replant every time we try and plant too early. So back down to some cultivating. We don't rotary hoe very much, and when we do, we only do it on soybeans, and it's after that first cultivation. So if you can see that we kind of squeeze the dirt right up to the row as tight as we can, and this little picture here, kind of little diagram, you can see how the profile of the dirt is mounded up on either side of the plant, and then when we rotary hoe, we use it kind of like a mulching tool, and it mulches that dirt right into the row real good and kind of seals it off. So any weeds that might be emerged after we've flamed, it will ideally cover them up good.
James, I had the same question. Can you go back to your cultivator?
Okay, yeah.
Talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, so we kind of came up with this. Well, I worked with another guy on it, a guy out of Indiana, had a hydraulic cultivator design, and so we played around with it, changed it, modified it to fit our needs, and but those are hydraulic tine baskets driven off a orbit motor, and instead of a sweep or a disc, those baskets are moving the soil into the row, and it has its place. One area where we feel like we really see a huge benefit from it is on the ends of the field. With a traditional cultivator, it takes some speed to move the soil into your row. So when you're slowing down, coming to the end of the row, or starting up, picking up speed at the beginning as you're starting out, you tend to have an area where you're not throwing dirt. What we found with this cultivator is it doesn't matter if you're going a half mile an hour or 4.5 or 5 mile an hour, it is moving the same amount of dirt into your row. So you can start out, drop your cultivator down, begin to pick up speed, and immediately it's working the dirt right into the row. And then the other area where we've really noticed it is if you do have really heavy grass pressure, like almost a sod of grass between your row, those baskets will really chew apart that sod to dry out those roots. And we found it really effective. So that's where we like to use that cultivator.
Yeah, I'd love to learn even more about that. It seems like it would have a lot of different applications.
I've got a video of it going on some corn. This was popcorn in 2019. That it was actually replanted middle of June, and little video of it in action there. It's something that we're still kind of experimenting with. It's still a prototype, and we've been playing around with it, making changes here and there. But it's an expensive tool with all the hydraulic motors. And a lot of bearings. There's a lot of moving parts, which we don't like about it. But
Well, thanks really so much for sharing that. We're kind of running out of time here, so I'll just make time for one last question. It's both for James and Paul, and I think a question near and dear to my heart. Do either of you incorporate livestock into your operation, or ever do things like graze cover crops or crop residues? Maybe Paul, if you want to speak to that real quick.
I no longer have livestock of my own. I used to have hogs. I'm too old for that. So what I have is a neighbor who has a cow-calf operation but doesn't have any egg land. So I give him all the straw from my small grains. And then at the end of the day, he gives me back the manure and bedding mixed together. And that's what I use to compost. So I have quite a bit of compost. But yeah, I wish I had livestock. I'm just too old.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, we run some cattle on our stocks, graze the popcorn. They really like it, actually, and main reason for that is to try and cut down on the volunteer corn the next year in our soybeans. A lot of times that can be a battle if we had down popcorn. So that's really the only area that we utilize cattle, livestock, and grazing.
Well, thanks so much, guys. I'm just going to share my screen for the last couple of minutes here. And thank you so much, everybody, for attending today and spending some time with us on a complex issue. Just want to throw it out there. We'll be back next Friday and talking about the transition process. So be sure to let any of your friends, colleagues, neighbors that have been asking you questions about being certified organic know that this might be a good conversation that they could join in on. We do post the recordings of these chats on our YouTube page. Just look for Organic Farm Team on YouTube. And we'd like to invite you to join us as well coming up pretty soon here in March. We're going to have a summit. We'd encourage you to check out organicfarmteam.com. We have a full agenda, lots of speakers and panelists from very diverse backgrounds, both in the food and ag industry side, as well as growers trying all different kinds of things on their operations. So with that, I'll say goodbye and happy Friday. Thanks all.